Folks, good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to welcome all of you to our book talk tonight. My name is Matthew Kahn. I'm the new director of the 21st Century Cities Initiative at Johns Hopkins. I see a lot of excitement in the room. I see young people and other people. Folks, the goal of my center is to bring us together to talk about urban ideas, and I can think of no better way than to kick off the start of our year with introducing Professor Rucker Johnson of UC Berkeley. Rutger, who will be talking about his terrific new book that I have on my cell phone, and books is being sold out there very quickly. Professor Rucker Johnson, we've been friends for 15 years. I don't know where the time goes. Rutger holds a very prestigious endowed chair at UC Berkeley and is an expert on education and labor issues. And I know while he's a very accomplished man, he's a modest man, and he wants me to keep this short. And so I'm going to shake his hand. Folks, can we welcome Rucker Johnson?
Thank you. It's great to be with you, and I really appreciate you all being here. I think that it's fitting that we honor in our even discussion on this day and on this week the significant contributions and pioneering efforts of Representative Congressman Elijah Cummings. His wife said he worked until his last breath because he believed our democracy was the highest and best expression of our collective humanity, and that our nation's diversity was our promise, not our problem. And I think it's also fitting one of his quotes that our children are the living messengers we send to a future we will never see. That he believed it was our responsibility to give our kids a better life. So in many ways, those words are the spirit behind the work and efforts to try to produce research that would inform policy around the issues that increase opportunity for children. And the two biggest areas that influence the opportunities for kids are in education and housing. And yet those are the two areas in which civil rights have made the least progress because of segregation. And so as we go forth in this particular work in Children of the Dream, we sought to first highlight that integration is not just about assignments of students to classrooms and by race, but it's centrally about equitable school resources. It's about access to the highest quality teachers. It's about curricular quality and teacher diversity. And yet, our heavy reliance on the local property tax base to fund schools has also been another form of segregation, both then and now. And so what we want to consider is our ability to import lessons from the past in our efforts to integrate our schools and link those data with high resolution information and designs that can tease out the causal impacts long-term and into the next generation of the early efforts of school integration, and then bring them forward to consider what has led to the resegregation of our schools. For let's consider that between 40 and 42% of Black and Latino children today attend schools in which less than 10% of their peers are non-Hispanic white. And what we want to recognize is that our population of school children has never been more diverse, but the growing dimensions of concentrated poverty schools and racial isolation continues to have long-term impacts, not only on our children, but on our democracy. What we want to consider is the three myths first of school integration. I think it was Mark Twain that once said, it's not what we don't know that kills us, but it's what we know for sure that just ain't so. And so there's a lot of conventional wisdom, both on the long-run effects of school spending, on integration, where you hear a lot of conversation, even in those first presidential debates with Kamala Harris and Biden kind of revisiting past policies and positions. One clear myth is that we tried it for a long time. For in fact, It was the 65th anniversary of the Brown decision that we celebrated in May. So certainly this was something we've already tried. It didn't work. It was social engineering from the start. And moreover, it's no longer relevant. We're talking about just dusting off for historical curiosity. Well, those are the three things that I hear time and time again, and it makes my ears cringe only because of the significant ways that it's devoid of the realities, that we only actually have about a 15-year window in which significant integration efforts occurred. Obviously, there's a little bit of a spoiler alert that I wouldn't really be here talking about this work if I couldn't hopefully convince you that these policies actually work spectacularly well. And we need to understand what the mechanism pathways through which they had their impacts. But a big part of their impacts exceed those that you could just measure by looking at educational metrics. The one thing I want to highlight about it no longer being relevant is simply to consider the fact that we actually have many districts suburbanizing, diversifying, and yet they are being continuously functioning separate and still unequal. So in many ways, Thurgood Marshall was right, and we want to kind of document the reasons why so that we can think about a path forward that has equity and diversity aligned. Now, one of the things I want to highlight that's really so that we can get into the panel discussion is first I want to highlight the fact that the period at which we saw the greatest racial convergence in academic achievement, in educational outcomes, even in earnings, even in health status, were the period at which the cohorts that experienced this most significant efforts at integration. And we're talking about those cohorts where we see the black-white achievement gap. This is in reading that's shown in this particular figure, where we saw the black-white achievement gap decline by 40%, and then we've seen since cohorts born since 1985 forward, we've seen a big stagnation in that. And that's very much aligned with the resegregation patterns of our schools. And we're gonna provide evidence that documents that rapid convergence that we saw in the black-white achievement gap is directly attributable to integration. Now, one of the things that people often highlight is the significant increases in per pupil spending, a 192% increase in per pupil spending since the 70s. And simultaneously, people will then draw a line that documents what is characterized as stagnant academic achievement using math and reading scores among 17-year-olds. And what I just want to highlight, number one, is using aggregate time series data that really doesn't enable one to really identify the causal connections between school by tracing out the life chances of children followed from birth to adulthood, cause you to miss, and this be a very misleading representation of the efficacy of school policies to change the outcomes of kids. So I just want to try to remind us where we started, because the timing of school integration and the timing of school funding reforms and the timing of pre-K investments, those are going to be the three biggest equal education opportunity policies we've pursued in this country. And all three of them need to be kind of thought of as a three-pronged approach to realize the promise of equal education opportunity. School integration is doing it through redistributing school children. School funding reforms are doing it by redistributing school resources so that they're not tied solely to local property tax wealth. And the pre-K investments that began with the rollout of Head Start are doing it through redistributing the timing of investments back to the earliest years of cognitive development. And what we're kind of highlighting in this book is it's not just integration as a policy, but it's integration as the very approach to policy. That when we do these things in concert, school integration with school funding reform, with early pre-K investments, and do them in concert, that the impacts, the synergistic impacts on children's life chances are the keys that open and unlock the doors that our children are in need. So when we think about Brown, we typically think of Topeka, Kansas, right? That it was one district, but really it was actually 5 plaintiffs from 5 different states that became what we now know as Brown. And in a similar way, this work is trying to not just feature a single district or a single time period, but it's trying to link together 3 generations of adult outcomes who are systematically differed in their exposure to these school policy reforms, and then trace out the impacts in a kind of generational mobility way. Now, what I want you to kind of see is when we're talking about integration, a lot of times people stop with desegregation when that's really the first step. Moving from desegregation to integration is moving from access to inclusion. It's moving from exposure to understanding. And that is a process that doesn't happen both overnight, but it's also something that's not just about assignments to school children, but it's about how those resources are distributed. So we want to kind of first highlight using the full universe of every school desegregation court case. There's about 1,000 districts that ever came under court order. We're going to use the quasi-random and uneven pace of that timing as a natural experiment so that we can be able to examine exactly what those impacts are. One of the things that I think is underappreciated is simply that the slow pace of integration meant that the first decade after Brown, there was very limited actual integration efforts that were achieved. It wasn't until the 1964 Civil Rights Act put teeth in enforcement that the subsequent provisions of the Elementary Secondary Education Act of '65 and the Medicaid and Medicare that said withholding federal funds for those districts and communities that weren't in compliance with hospital desegregation as well as school desegregation. And that's what provided some of the financial incentives that accelerated the levels of desegregation court orders to achieve integration. So I want to just highlight this with the maps. This is 1954, obviously. Where you see a red is where there was the first district court order. There was very limited integration efforts that were achieved without a court order. You can see, as Walter Gilhorn described, the pace of integration in that first decade after Brown as one of an extraordinarily arthritic snail. But that picked up speed right after the '64, so that by 1972, the South becomes more integrated than the rest of the country. And then what you see, acceleration, this map is going quite quickly, but what you see is this growing pink, which there was an acceleration of releases of the court order, where there was a big set of judicial Supreme Court conservative precedent rulings that ruled against using race in the assignment of students to schools and increase the ability of districts to return to neighborhood schools, which because of the significant extent of residential segregation patterns by race and class, re-entrenched and led to some of the resegregation that we see in today's schools. So I want to highlight, obviously, the 2007 Parents Involved case that involves Seattle and Louisville are a big component of some of that, but I'll highlight that as we move forward. What I really want to highlight first is this is a difficult empirical investigation, in part because the 1960s is actually a miracle in policymaking when we think about the equity initiatives that came from this period. The Head Start, neighborhood health centers that accompanied the Economic Opportunity Act of '64, the Civil Rights of '64, the Food Stamp Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the Elementary Secondary Education Act with Title I, the Fair Housing Act of '68. I mean, all of these things have their own independent effect, but it's really the fact that the timing of the desegregation court orders are happening unevenly that are independent of this timing that enables us to look at, say, cohorts from my parents' era who were born in the late 40s, early 50s, basically went through segregated schools throughout their school age years. Whereas my cohort, not to reveal my age, but it's toward the end of that timeline, the disproportionate 90% of, or 80 to 90% of Black children were in districts that were under some kind of desegregation court order. So that's part of what we're talking about. One of the things that I think we gained a lot of insight with doing the book was that the quantitative data and the research designs for causal inference enable us to really get an aerial view of the causal impacts of these policies into the next generation even. But it was really the qualitative insights that we were able to gather with interviews with some of the pioneers of integration from Memphis, from Boston, from Charlotte, from Chicago, and some of the leading judges that presided over the landmark school funding cases and school desegregation cases, in addition to education leaders, helped us really understand the dimensions of what worked and why it worked. So this is an example. This is Chicago Public Schools, the first elementary school integrated cohort at Avalon Park Elementary School in March 1964 in Chicago. And I just want to oh, okay, I pushed the wrong button, okay. Let's see if I can do a clicker. Well, let's see, I think this, oh yes. Okay, this is Paul Gorin. Now, Paul Gorin is now, you may know, the Dr. Paul Gorin, the superintendent of schools in Evanston Public Schools. And we were able to interview him. This is Forrest Jones, one of his classmates that ended up becoming a physician and one of the first African-American physicians to desegregate Chicago hospitals. The main thing I want to highlight is, this is March 1964, their kindergarten cohort. You can see and appreciate the diversity of that kindergarten class. This is only 3 years later. This is Avalon Park, third grade class. And what I want you to just recognize is the picture has changed. It has become darker, metaphorically speaking. But Paul Gorin is still here, smiling. This is the next year, again, fourth grade. Paul Gorin is still smiling. Now, people sometimes think that like this was some, you know, just parent segregation is some like random accident coincidence. This was a very coordinated effort by real estate agents to try to undermine the integration efforts. These were very fierce. Paul Gorin talks about how the real estate agents would be calling his parents, threatening about how their housing equity was going to plummet and how this was going to be disastrous for their kids and that they were going to be vulnerable to violent crime and all manner of things. I just want you to understand, while the commentary has more subtle, less racist undertones, some of the same types of language and conversations around the resistance to school integration have just evolved, but they are very much still in the underbelly of some of those efforts. Now, what I think is helpful is generally people think about school segregation as something of the South, or they think about segregation as a minority problem, but it's really something that has impacts on all of us. This is Dorothy Count-Scoggins, the first to integrate Charlotte Public Schools. We got in-depth interviews with her. This is, you can see I should not overlook the fact that that first day, you can see she wasn't receiving a warm reception. But these pioneers really opened the doors of creating new climates of opportunity. This is Dewania Kyles, the first to integrate the Memphis Public Schools, and our ability to kind of connect. Their families were very close to Martin King in those efforts to ensure that those opportunities were occurred. So their reflections as adults about how those experiences shaped their career trajectories were just invaluable. We try to really highlight that in the book, but I'm going to just give you a sense of the overall quantitative evidence about the long-term effects, where we're using the quasi-random variation in timing. So there may have been a black child born in 1960 who was already 17 by the time the district court order happened in their district of upbringing. So they went to basically confined to segregated schools throughout their school age years. Where a black child in that same year, born in that same year, but in a neighboring district, may have experienced integration throughout their school age years because the desegregation court order happened many years earlier. So it's those differences, children that are otherwise similar, that then we're able to look at outcomes. This is an example of the impacts on racial school segregation reductions. We see about a 30 percentage point reduction in racial school segregation despite the white flight that I mentioned before. And what people overlook is that they think about the assignment of students to schools, thinking about it's only about separation of people. But it's really a hoarding of opportunity that's at play. So when we look at the way district spending was allocated, the district level spending was disproportionately allocated to the majority white schools. With school desegregation court orders, we saw a significant increase in school spending so that students from the same school who were exposed throughout their school age years experienced about a 20% increase in spending relative to those same children from the same school, but who were 17 at the time of the court order. That level of school spending equalization led to the significant reductions in class sizes, and these are some of the inputs that led to the significant changes in outcomes that we're going to trace out in adulthood. Now, in the interest of time, because we have a talented group of panelists that definitely are going to comment and things, so I'm going to try to be at a high level to say we have nationally representative data for more than 13,381 children who are now in their 30s, 40s, and 50s using the panel study of income dynamics, which is the longest running panel data set in the world. We link the census addresses at the block level to the school addresses that prevailed, the school district boundaries that prevailed in the late 60s. And I'm just going to try to show you first the outcomes for educational attainment. Sorry. So this is the change in years of completed educational attainment. In the years leading up to the quarter, we see a flat line, but with each additional year of exposure, we see a dose response. That with each year that children are treated for the symptoms of being confined to poorly funded and segregated schools, that for each year that they're exposed to integrated schools, we see a dose response and improvement that increases both with the duration of exposure as well as the intensity of the integration effort. What I want to highlight throughout is you're not going to see any negative impacts for whites. So there was a lot of concerns about how this is a zero-sum game and we're basically taking resources away from one group and it's going to disadvantage another group. This is actually an effort that not only produced equity, but produced improvements across the board when we're talking about how school resources were impacting the outcomes for kids. Now, this is educational attainment. We saw this transmit itself, just to give you a sense of this, like more than a year increase in educational attainment. This is like large enough to close much of the black-white educational attainment gap, so that by the early 80s, 18 and 19-year-old African-American college-going rates had risen to the same levels as whites. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of that change, as late as 1960, only 20% of black men graduated from high school. That rate in 1960 was 50% for white men. Only 3% of African-American males went to college, graduated four-year college in 1960. That rate was 13% for white males. These changes actually happened quickly with regard to these changes in access. So we see this increase in educational attainment transmit itself both in increased high school graduation rates with about a 3 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school with each additional year of exposure, again with no impacts for non-Hispanic whites. Similarly, these impacts translated decades later into significant increases in earnings, where we saw, again, no pre-existing time trend, but a significant increase in earnings, about a 30% increase in earnings for children born from coming from the same district, but comparing those that were exposed throughout their school age years versus children from those same districts that were confined to segregated schools throughout. So the main point of all of this is that these did not just have impacts on educational attainment, but they translated into returns that entered the labor market. And while I don't have time to describe some of this, they also led to a severing of the intergenerational cycle of poverty. So while at the beginning of this period, say, more than 3/4 of African American children were poor, we're seeing in adulthood that with each additional year of exposure to desegregated schools, we're seeing upwards of a 20 percentage point drop in the annual incidence and likelihood of being poor in adulthood. So these were some of the big catalysts in building a black middle class. And what I want to just highlight is that these then also led to marriage rates that were more, the likelihood of marriage did not change, but the likelihood of staying married. That economic instability is a big risk factor for marital dissolution. We see even impacts on marriage outcomes. Again, now generally people focus on like incarceration through criminal justice policies. And what we try to highlight in the book throughout is that some of our most effective antidotes to criminal involvement are access to highly functioning schools in the K-12 years, that these investments more than pay for themselves. And we see that despite it being an era of entering mass incarceration, we see that the likelihood of court-ordered school desegregation exposure significantly reducing the likelihood of incarceration in adulthood. So One of the things, I know I'm talking quickly, I'm just trying to give you the essence of the main gist of the results. One of the things that people generally think of when they think of desegregation is they think of school desegregation. And some of the things that get lost is hospital desegregation actually preceded it. And what we look for is synergistic effects of hospital desegregation, where Ken Shea and other co-authors have documented it significantly reduced infant mortality and improved infant health. We document how that also resulted in healthier children being better learners. And so we see interactive effects of the school integration and the hospital integration leading to results where sometimes people document that the currency of inequality is best measured in quality of life, health, life expectancy, and that in that way the reciprocal of poverty is health. And what we document is that we see impacts of these integration efforts leading to subsequent improvements in health. We're talking about the difference about being exposed to integrated schools throughout their school age years being on par with being 7 years younger. So those are kind of aspects that have to do with the social determinants of health, because educational attainment is a major determinant of health. Now, in the interest of time, let me just try to at least say a couple words, which are that it is not sufficient to just have integration if there's still a lot of school resource inequity. That school funding reform is a necessary ingredient, that investments in pre-K really augment these efforts. It's a fact that almost a half of the achievement gap that we see among third graders already existed at kindergarten entry. And so we have to kind of marry. Yesterday I was giving a set of discussions with a set of faculty around and students around our work on pre-K and K-12 reforms that also have these synergies. In the book, we profile that. In the time that I have here, I'm not going to talk about any of those results, but I will say that what we find is the Head Start impacts and school funding reforms have a similar series, but this kind of synergy of effects. I need to kind of get to bringing it forward. So what I showed you so far is really a set of cohorts that were born between 1950 and 1975 that have been followed into adulthood. But we recognize that while they're in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, they have their own children. So we wanted to look at how has the experience of the parents impacted their children's outcomes who are now in young adulthood and their educational attainment outcomes. But we also wanted to consider the fact that now that we have this resegregation of schools, how has the resegregation affected recent cohorts of children? So in the same way that we use the timing of the desegregation court orders, we then began to use the timing of the release of the court orders to see how the resegregation patterns were affecting and having educational consequences. Now, one of the things that I want you to kind of appreciate about integration is that oftentimes we will have desegregated schools. And on the face of it, you'll think, oh, wow, this is a very diverse school. And it's very important that you look at the curricular quality, right? Because the placement in gifted and talented programs, or the disproportionality in placement in special ed, often inappropriately, or the underestimation of minority children's potential, and the ways in which teachers sometimes have implicit biases that feed that. The point that I want to highlight is the nature of segregation today often is happening through curricular access. College preparatory tracks that are disproportionately non-Hispanic, white, and Asian, and the lower tracks that are remedial and non-college preparatory that are disproportionately Black and brown children. Those are the types of efforts that we have to counteract. So those kinds of details are a very important part of what's needed. What we document is that leading up to the release of the court order, we did see a significant positive pre-trend in the increasing rates of high school graduation rates for African Americans. And after the release of the court order, we then saw that progress stagnate. And oftentimes, what district leaders were willing to accept to get the neighborhood schools, often it was like an exchange of some money that they would say, if we allow us to return to neighborhood schools, we'll give the higher poverty schools some more money. But if you follow the money for any number of years, you will see that while that money was committed for like 1 or 2 years, within like 3 years, it's right back to like significant school resource inequity along the fault lines of race and class. So I want to highlight that when we're talking about this, because I'm going to my close, realizing, as my pastor says, if you don't put me on a timeline, I'll keep you all night. So let me just try to make sure we get to the panel discussion, but let me just leave you with this. Oftentimes we're focused on the test score as some like omnibus like measure of what's happening in a classroom. And our schools are producing so much more. And as I teach in a school of public policy where diversity of perspectives and the diversity that you learn with diversity of people in those perspectives represented in the classroom, there's the contact hypothesis that Martin King, I think, most eloquently articulated, that people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. Now, I think that this is where our children have the biggest places for us to learn from them. That our children aren't born with the same biases, that these are learned, and just like segregation is man-made, the solutions to integration will also have to be man-made through policy changes and deliberate ones, because the way we got here are through policy choices. What we do is try to highlight that there's been a growing political polarization of political attitudes expressed in adulthood, as well as those of a surge of racial intolerance, whether it's reflected in immigration reform debates, et cetera. What we do is we use data from the ad health data that was administered at UNC. It's nationally representative, but it was a set of school-based samples where they followed kids into adulthood. And we see this like significant increase in political polarization among what these are now folks in their 30s and 40s, early 30s, early 40s. And what we do is show how their political views stated in adulthood are rooted in the lack of diversity in their school years or the presence of it. And we see it not just in, say, whether their adult friendship networks include any racial diversity, not just the racial diversity of their adult neighborhoods that is kind of a revealed preference, but we see it in how diverse the kind of schools they send their kids to. We see it in same-race partner differences, but importantly, we see it in the kind of liberal political views that have to do with anything that has to do with equity and empathy for kind of social justice kinds of things. These are things that are self-reported, but we see a connection directly between those where non-Hispanic whites are much more likely to express views that are equity-minded, and also a set of occupations that are more civic-oriented when they were in schools as children that were more integrated and diverse. Now, I'm going to just close by saying these are not issues that are in Maryland. These are not issues that are in, the South, though we may highlight Birmingham. In the book, we highlight Charlotte and many kind of places in which this is salient. But in my home Bay Area, I want you to understand that there was a recent ruling just last month. The charter school was 41% white. The district school 1 mile apart was 7% white. Now, you can kind of do the math, but let me just suggest some sets of people are using the charter school growth as ways to avoid the diversity. We have to think about what the policy instruments that are being used in contemporary world to desegregate schools. Now, I feel like I should at least highlight a few things about Baltimore, okay? So the Black-White Achievement Gap, certainly it's one of the most segregated schools, districts, and communities in the country. You don't need me to tell you that, but I think one of the things that has to be recognized is that we're talking about Black children's achievement scores, even within Baltimore City schools, roughly 2 grade levels behind that of their white counterparts. And What's, I think, important, this is using the 100 largest districts, where if it's on the kind of diagonal, it's where white scores are on the same as black scores. And you can certainly see that the magnitude of the black-white achievement gap across the country. But I think what I want to highlight for you, let's highlight it here, okay, is that this is work by Sean Reardon and colleagues, but it's very complementary to the points I'm trying to make here within the book, is that on the x-axis, if you look at the white-black socioeconomic segregation between schools, we're really talking about the differences in poverty concentrations between schools. So places that have a bigger gap between schools on socioeconomic poverty, independent of family background, independent of family level poverty. We're talking about the school-based poverty concentrations. The black-white difference, what we're talking about is like the difference between how whites are exposed to poor students versus blacks' exposure to poor students within the district. And what difference that makes is a big part of that is how teacher quality is connected to school poverty. And so you see, as the white-black socioeconomic segregation increases, so does the y-axis, which is the white-black achievement gap. And that's measured in grade levels. So it's about a 2-year grade level difference. And the thing that I want to highlight in this figure is, a lot of times you'll hear people say, we can accept segregation and we're just going to throw money at the problem. They seem like more comfortable with that approach. I just want to highlight, there's not a single district in the country that's even moderately segregated that doesn't have a significant black-white achievement gap. So if it was possible that we could just throw money at it, certainly there would be a North Star example beside Harlem Children's Zone, where obviously that's aspirational, but many districts don't have not only a Jeffrey Canada, but Wall Street money to back it. So let's not like put that particular example aside. The fact that we don't have any district in the whole country that has even a moderate level of segregation without more than a grade level gap in the black-white achievement gap. Can you see? So I think what we're trying to say is money alone is not enough. And the only thing I want to maybe close on is, this is the redlining patterns in Baltimore way back in the day. But if I take the name off of this map and I show you something like, I don't know, the risk of lead exposure. Now, you may not like see exactly the code, but if I didn't put the name on it, you might not know which map it is. Now, all I'm making the point is some of the in-school differences in achievement are actually coming from out-of-school exposure risk. And that's why we have to connect the dots between housing segregation, school segregation, housing policy, and health-related interventions that promote the well-being of all kids. I am going to close there. I really want to close on a good note. So let me just say that the impacts that I described did not just transmit themselves into that generation, but the next generation's outcomes that is based on the parents' exposure to integration. We saw their children's likelihood of going to college, of completing high school, their cognitive test scores, all improved as a function of their children's, their parents' previous access to integrated schools. And this is just a point that a big part of intergenerational mobility is coming through parental education and access. So I'm gonna just come back to this slide just so that I can close here. Thank you very much.
Folks, that was fantastic. I wanted to walk you through the rest of our program for tonight, but we're off to a great start. We're about to have 3 panelists share their thoughts. We're then going to have a lively panel with Q&A to give you a chance to participate. And then we're going to have a reception. It's going to be time to party. Tough room. And then we're going to ask Professor Johnson to sign many of the books he's sold tonight, much higher book sales than mine. Folks, I want to let's do it like this. I'm going to bring up to the to the podium a new friend of mine, Ms. Cristina Duncan Evans. Cristina is the chair of the Teachers Chapter of the Baltimore Teachers Union, and she's a teacher at James McHenry Elementary Middle School.
Should I stay here or should I go over there? Okay. Do you want me to? I can. Which
Sorry,
do you
were you
prefer?
saying that the setup would be that I would come up here and all of the other panelists would as well?
So, Matt,
You get everybody.
Okay, great.
I'll do whatever feels
All
comfortable.
directions.
oh, so please, I forgot about script.
You can grab the mic and give your response.
Oh, sure. I could talk about Baltimore Teachers Union and the last year at length. It's been a very busy year with Baltimore Teachers Union. We have new leadership. But I'd like to talk about two things I learned this week about how school integration and segregation is playing out in Maryland currently. You may know that Howard County is in the midst of a large-scale community conversation about its plan to move the poverty level at its schools from 50% to 40%. It's not a very dramatic plan. Howard County, being one of the wealthier school districts and counties in Maryland, and also being a place where people talk about the importance of moving there for the high quality schools, has really become a lightning rod for a lot of conversation about school desegregation, again, on a plan that is not that dramatic. So the Maryland State Board of Education, this is my personal opinion, not the opinion of the Baltimore Teachers Union, does not get enough credit for the ways it upholds racial inequality in the state. And so one of the things that they have debated as recently as this week is creating a waiver policy so that essentially if a Howard County student was assigned to a school and their parent didn't like it, Howard County could say, no, your student is assigned to this school, this is your school now. That parent could write a vague letter to the state board allowing them to overturn that rule. And basically give the parent access to whatever school they wanted, giving parents a way to enable white flight again. And so they're actively looking for ways to look the other way when it comes to school desegregation. So there was one other piece that I'm sure will come up in conversation, but it's flown out of my head right now. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second panelist is Professor Eric Rice from the Hopkins School of Education, where he teaches and does research about urban school reform.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I wanted to start with, we had an opportunity to talk at a paper that Dr. Johnson gave yesterday, but I wanted to start with actually one of the things that I started with yesterday. And that's really just saying thank you for making some points that I think the research is clear on, but people aren't always. So just real quickly, the whole idea, making that distinction between desegregation, integration, and then the way that we could still have something looking like integration but actually tracking. Two is, I always, as somebody trained in anthropology, appreciate when somebody gets up, particularly an economist, and talks about the importance of qualitative research. So thank you for that. But most importantly about focusing on the importance of resources, because I think that's something that we still hear all the time, is that, when you pointed to some of the correlational studies that, oh, resources don't really matter. So it's really good to hear you go through the details of why they do and that they do. And finally, and also just making the point that debunking the myth that integration doesn't work. The main thrust of the talk, I think, is so crucial. But I did want to talk a little bit about the mechanism by which integration works. And I had the opportunity to actually get the book today and get through it to some. And I wanted to read one quote about it because, you make clear that you're not claiming white students are a panacea or anything of that sort. But you guys write, when we say integration works, let's be clear. Our argument is not predicated on the false notion that poor and minority children can't learn in schools without white and non-poor children. Likewise, any assessment of the school's quality based solely on the racial composition of its students would be woefully incomplete. So what makes integration work? It's in part the resulting impacts of integration on both school resources and school practices. And clearly at the end of the talk today, you went beyond that and presented a more positive view of the importance of integration for all students. But I wanted to just think about that resource question for a minute because I found that really depressing. Because essentially the conclusion, which is not surprising but is depressing, is that we as a society are not willing to devote resources to schools unless they have white kids in them. So that is just one point that struck me from the work that you did, and I did want to ask you, as I said, you hit this at the end to some extent, but if resources alone are not enough to fix the problem, could you talk a little bit more about the sort of positive vision for integration that you have and what else might be going on there beyond just the access to resources? So just a question about resources. The second point that I wanted to hit on a little bit is just this relationship between schools and the rest of the society. And there's an implication in the book that if we solve the school integration problem, we're also going to have an impact on all kinds of other things in society, including housing, segregation, healthcare. And you talk about the important ways that these are interrelated, and even suggest in the book that if he had gone to a school that was perhaps more integrated, the police officer who killed Michael Garner might have had a different way of approaching that. Through familiarity, this contact hypothesis, we might actually end up treating one another better. And I guess it makes me very curious about how you see the relationship between educational, the story of education and education reform and all the other factors that you talk about. And so why start, given the current policy environment and particularly the state and federal administrations, or even thinking about it from a strategic point of view, why start with school integration as opposed to focusing on some of those resource issues and some of the issues that are related to other kinds of inequality, whether that's healthcare, whether that's housing policy. So that would be the second set of issues that I would bring up. And then finally, and I was glad to see you talk about it in the talk today, because it was a really short section in the book, but this whole idea of the role played by choice and charters in this. And I think that we're, most of us are probably familiar with the ways that school choice was used as a way of resisting integration, right? And using vouchers to be so that white families could start their own schools and not allow other children in. And Baltimore's an interesting case here, and I'd be interested in your reaction to it, because to their credit, in some ways, and those of you who might have heard me talk about charters before know I have really mixed feelings about this, but in Baltimore, our most integrated schools are charter schools, with a couple of exceptions. However, these schools present really difficult questions related to, I think, things like resource capture, in terms of the funding status that they have, because they have those white parents, they have been successful in, I would argue, and there are certainly different views on this, they've been successful in getting, I would say, more money for their schools. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on charters and other varieties of school choice as a mechanism for integration, especially given this history. And I really liked the line that was in one of the last couple pages of the book, but about the ways that choice has become about individual benefit, as opposed to choices that we might make about the public mission for education. So I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that.
Great.
And then finally, the last thing that I just wanted to end with is, given the sort of controversial nature of integration and how much it has been resisted over the years, and given my kind of lack of faith in my fellow white people, if I might just put it that way, what would you do first of all of the different things that we could focus on? I know you're in a school of public policy, and thinking about the ways that we might begin to address some of these issues in the achievement gap. Is integration the place to start? Is there lower hanging fruit that might help Baltimore? You talk about patience in the book and the need for patience. The Baltimore City students have been waiting a long time, and they need something now. How would you start? What's the low hanging fruit, and how might you go about trying to? How would you think about the different policy initiatives that you would put in place first and now, so that we don't have to wait to get to some of the effects that you've got? Okay, and I'll stop there.
All right. Well, those are all great. A great set of comments and a great set of leading questions that I think all of us should ponder. I'm going to give you some of my reactions both to both of your comments that I think are very important. I think your comments about Howard County, and we have a whole contingent that are here representing Howard County, and they have a lot of insight that they can share about the challenges that they've experienced. We have President Scott coming from the City Council joining us. So maybe should I allow President Scott to offer his comments first, because maybe that might make most sense. And
This is your show. Let's let the council president catch his breath.
yeah, okay, very well. Yes. So I think one of the things that we want to be kind of very clear about is that we're typically talking about student school assignments. And one of the things that you should keep in mind is the parents involved case of 2006-7 that involved Seattle and Louisville was a very pivotal case because it ruled race could not be the sole factor in student school assignments. But it basically equalized, the Supreme Court ruling basically treated as equal, using race to kind of counteract racism, segregation, as using race to reinforce it. Or to ameliorate it through integration. And so I think it's wrong-minded, but I also think it creates an opportunity to recognize that the ways segregation plays a role has to incorporate socioeconomic diversity. And so it created actually opportunity for us to rethink how we design our student school assignment plans to be both racially and ethnically diverse, as well linguistically, as well as socioeconomically. So I think that's a very important component. And I also think that the fact that 2/3 of segregation today is between district versus a generation ago, probably 2/3 was within district lines. And the reason that creates a much more thorny challenge to the path forward is simply that now, if not more important than ever, housing policy and zoning, restrictions and ordinances, and this is maybe where Columbia, Maryland is like distinct in that way, that they have a history of having a more inclusionary housing zoning ordinance set of policies that we should be then still inspired by. So I think the housing piece has to, be a component to a viable and sustainable integration effort today. I also think that, the Milliken decision is related to this because now you're not hearing a lot of like riots and the kind of explicit animosity around integration. What you see is just like threats of seceding from the district, threats of I'm just going to take my money and move elsewhere, threats of I'm going to, like everything that's about like trying to keep the middle class families happy. So we don't try to use too much language on equity because we might cause too much ruckus with regard to the middle class family. So I think that that's like a political thing, but I think doing right because it's right is really what has to occur. So I think one of the missing ingredients in all the conversations are actually like who's at the head of that classroom and how are we supporting those teachers that are doing the real heavy lifting around how we teach and support that. And the reason the money is very important to that is that our teacher salary structure is not really situated to give more income and salary to those teachers that are maybe working in more disadvantaged communities. Actually, they often get less. And then we have these highly concentrated poverty schools, higher proportion of special needs, higher proportion of English language learners, higher proportion of poverty, and then we're expecting them to, like, without those supports, not get burnt out. Remember, 1 in 5 nationwide teachers leave within the first 5 years. But like in Baltimore, in urban areas, it's like 1 in 2 leave within 5 years. The profession. A big part of that, like, exodus is happening among the most talented teachers moving to more affluent areas and still staying in the profession. But it's leaving in its wake, it's in the back, it's leaving children that are most vulnerable. Black and Hispanic children are 2 times more likely to be taught by inexperienced teachers. In 33 states across the country, they're more likely to be taught by inexperienced teachers than experienced ones. You want to think about, I teach like math and quantitative methods, and I'm kind of, you can think of economics as in the STEM field, like umbrella. But like a third of public high schools that enroll significant numbers of minority and Hispanic children, a third of those public high schools don't even offer calculus. Now remember, that's like a gatekeeper to a STEM field major. So all of this that's curricular quality, but what I'm saying is those are the things that we then see in high school, that we then see in college going rates. Those are the things that are a big part of the feeder. So I think teacher quality and how we make sure that we're retaining, developing high quality teachers, but also a more diverse teaching workforce. And this is where the state and federal level can no longer have a hands-off approach. This is where the districts themselves face so much incentive to segregate that we have to kind of put money where the mouth is, because even right now there's a federal provision that says, this is actually one of Biden's legacy that he's not willing to own, but he in the early 70s, his resistance to integration, passed a bill that's still on the books that prohibits federal funds for integration efforts. Today, but that was passed originally in the 70s. Now, my only point is that when are we gonna like say integration is part of what we're gonna have a goal for? Now you said, what will we do first? I would still say, instead of leading with school student assignment as the first step, in my ideal world, I do think it would be better if we led with school resource equity, teacher quality, and the optimal distribution of that so that it's not so unequal across schools. And then I think it would be easier to then have the student assignment plans to be more receptive to them. But I think middle class families in general are not, integration is not a path forward as long as those are also the classrooms that are overcrowded, that those are the classrooms that are being taught by inexperienced teachers that aren't even trained in their subject area. Like as long as that's the prevailing modal experience, I don't think that people are gonna buy in to this. But I do think when it is done in the ways that we're describing, in a holistic, curricular quality, gifted programs, all of those things, then I think the benefits of diversity are things our country hasn't even yet realized. So I think there's a real potential that I'm hopeful, and I think the research evidence is beginning to catch up. And we just have to kind of revive the movement. So those are not everything that you said, but I would say those are the things that came to mind as we were talking about.
Mr. Scott, welcome back to Hopkins.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? It's working. Good evening, and thank you, Professor Johnson. Thank you. It's always great to be back on the Hopkins campus. It's been about a week and 3 days since I've been here.
We missed you.
Yeah, week and 3 days. We'll see how quick I get back the next time. I think I came in at the right time, and I want to thank you for writing a book that so plainly lays out the challenges that we still face. Right? I think that when you look at the arguments in this book, I think the most important one for me is one that gets lost a lot, especially for people that are like me in elected office and people that are calling in office. There is no panacea to this problem. It won't be solved just by funding. It won't be solved just by programs. We have to look at these things holistically from top to bottom to see the issues and how we can close that achievement gap. And when you look at the patterns of segregation, you can look back in the past to see that. I always say, people say, why am I so passionate about young people in schools? If you follow me at all, you know there's been two things about my public service. There's been youth and public safety, right? And youth for me always centers around education and making sure young people have, because I know what that meant for me. And for me, it's really personal because my dad was in what we now call middle school, but junior high school when they integrated schools in rural North Carolina, Halifax County, where he lives. And for me, a lot of people in my generation here in Baltimore, their parents grew up here, right? I had one parent grow up here, one grew up in the rural South. And my dad, I talked to him every day, actually. I talked to him on the way up here. And I hear these stories about what happened to him and my uncles and my aunts when they were integrating schools, but also that, very interestingly, that they feel like they had a better education before their school got integrated, right? Because once their school was integrated, they now had educators who did not value them or spend any time or effort speaking to them. And two, they were put into situations consistently that took away from the education. I'll tell one quick story before going forward, and please excuse my language. In junior high school, my dad always tells the story, I'll never forget it, as long as I'm alive, about how one of his classmates, who was white, who lived directly across the street from the school, which is on 158 highway that I have to drive past every time I go to see my family, his father told him and gave him a gun and told him, it's okay for you to go to school and shoot one of those niggas. And he took the gun to school and didn't have the courage to do it and ended up getting into a fight with students. They took the gun, and the next day, his dad actually took him out on their front lawn and beat him butt naked, and they never saw him again. And just think about like the hatred that his dad had to have, that he tried to force his son to have, that he didn't have in his heart, and he just left. And for me now to grow up in Baltimore, right, a city that is, when I grew up, is majority African American, and live in a city that has a legacy of being the birthplace of housing segregation via legislation, right? In the very chamber, in the very chair that I sit in, someone sat in and said, this is where black people can live, this is where Jewish people can live, this is where Greek people can live in this city. And now you can see systematically how that has impacted education in Baltimore, right? Everyone in my staff knows that I love my high school. I'm from Baltimore. We don't celebrate where we went to college. We celebrate where we went to high school, right? I bleed Mervo blue and gold. But Mervo had to have a court order for it to be integrated, right? And my step-granddad was actually one of the first African Americans to go there. And just to think about how much older than me he is, and that when I started at Mervo in 1998, I went to the same exact building that he went to. No improvements, no nothing, literally until I got there. And how the conditions of those buildings also play. So for me, when you always hear these issues about HVAC and heating and funding for Baltimore City schools, it's not just a talking point for me. It's personal because I lived it. I've been in the classroom. Forget about not having heat. How about not having a window, like a window pane missing? Air conditioning was out of the question until I got to high school. So for me, these things are very, very personal, and we have to understand that it's going to take a lot of courage to fix them, right? So this week, actually, I sent a letter to our mayor asking that $34 million of surplus money that we found at the end of last fiscal year be used to help out with the school system's HVAC project. Anyone that knows anything about government funding, you never commit a surplus to ongoing funds, right? You always try to find some capital needs so you can do that. And when you see what happened here in Baltimore a few years ago, like that's a civil rights violation. But you can't, what happens a lot is people then lash out at the folks that are there now, not realizing that those checks were written sometimes before I was born, but definitely before I got on the city council, and more importantly, before I was an adult, right? I always say that no disrespect to the folks that came before me, that they wrote checks that might as well have had Spalding on them, because they're bouncing right now, because they didn't, right? They didn't make the investments or even really think beyond their political terms, right? They didn't think, how is the decision that I'm making today going to impact Baltimore and the education of Baltimore's young people in 20, 30 years? That wasn't a thought. Now we have to think like that. I always tell elected officials in Baltimore and beyond, think about how your decision is going to be impacted much longer than your term. And when you think about city schools and for air conditioning, it'll cost about $54 and $67 million to make sure that every school has heat and air. $34 million is a significant portion of that, right? And we know simultaneously we have this discussion about funding, because it is funding. We're in Maryland. We were, until we got a new governor, the wealthiest state and the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And we underfund our public schools by billions of dollars, right? We know that. And we don't spend enough, and we don't spend it equitably. As confirmed in this book, of 25 states nationwide with education funding disparities between wealthy and poor districts, we rank 15th in that. And we know that we have the money to do it. We can. It takes political courage. It takes true leadership to do that. And it can't be either or, right? We can't say, oh, we want kids to have AC and infrastructure and heat in their schools, and not say also they should be going to 21st school buildings with not lead paint, you know, that have actual windows and not built like prisons or built by the same people that built the prisons so they look the same, and that we can update the education, spend money in an equitable way, think about race, think about gender, think about economics. We can do both in Maryland. We just have to have the leadership to do it. That's why the Kerwin Commission is like the most important policy decision that has faced our state in a generation, and we have to push. We know what folks are doing, right? The governor is actually raising money to try to convince people in a Trumpish way, I'll give him Trump credit there, in a Trumpish way to not support the Kerwin Commission, because they know 70% of Maryland, there's even okay with raising taxes to pass this and make sure that we implement this. This is a decision that will have impacts for generations, because yes, it's about the money. It is about the money, but it's also about the policy, right? The policy of how the money gets spent, how the investments are made, making sure that inequities are erased. And that's why, for me, it was important last year on the city council, I championed equity legislation that ironically went into effect yesterday, that's now going to force all of our city agents to operate through a lens of equity. Everything they do, capital budget, operating budget, so that we can start to undo things that, you know, people always say like, oh, we have to fix the system. I'm like, no, the system is working the way it was intended to work. We have to build and redesign the system so that it works for everybody that lives in our city. And we can make sure that our young people are being educated, because we still go to segregated schools. I often say that the opportunity to go to a school where you know the educational level is going to, the rigor is going to be there, the care is going to be there, the community involvement is going to be there, is a great teller of the success. And for me, I can give a perfect example. I grew up in Park Heights, which is right over in Northwest Baltimore. I went to Dr. King Elementary School with Malcolm X first, and Dr. King Elementary School. And just by the luck of the draw, my mom found out about a citywide advanced academic program at Roland Park Middle, right? So I went to Roland Park for middle school. My mom and my friend Daryl's mom, we both went from Park Heights. And we just happened to, and I'm not going to name the other ones because they're either dead or struggling with substance abuse, but there were 3 of our other friends, 2 of them were no longer with us, who were on our Rec Center starting 5 basketball team. I was the shooting guard, if anybody was wondering. But 2 of them are gone, and 1 of them is severely addicted to drugs. Both of us are successful. He works for the fire department. I'm the city council president. When you look at him and I, there's not much difference in them. We lived in the same neighborhood, saw the same violence, same crappy school lunch, same rec center, all of that. Difference for us and them. 1, we went to Roland Park Elementary Middle and not Green Spring. 2, we went to Merville High School and not Northwestern. And our family structure, going to a school where at the time our classrooms were like 50-50, half white, half black, was unheard of in Baltimore. And this is not a long time ago. This is 1995, right? And it changed. It created an opportunity for us that many in Baltimore don't get, or didn't get, and still don't get, because we were being educated at a blue ribbon school with kids from all wealth ranges and a wide background. It works. We just have to be willing to cut through the racism, you know, people being scared about poor people, all the things that we've heard even in the news recently, and just be leaders and say no. And to be honest, I often say that what we need from our elected officials now, in this moment in this city, but state and most importantly the country, is we need elected officials who are unafraid to be unelected because they did the right thing, right? That's what we need. So if they don't reelect me because I believe in equity, I'll go off into the sunset knowing that I did the right thing. And good luck trying to get the law of repeal, right? But that's what we have to do.
That's
And
right.
I just wanted to stop by to say thank you, sir, for providing a thought-provoking piece, a book about this. And this is a conversation that we have to continue to have. And we have to have also with policymakers so that they can understand how they can, sometimes they just need a push on the courage to do these things.
That's great. Yeah. I really appreciate that. I think the one thing that I think is true is that the living testimonials and the life stories are really what hold they're the glue that hold the data together. Like, you can't allow statistics to kind of tell the story. Statistics are the undergirding, but it's the life stories of how these are affecting real people. And I think you have before you, an example, an illustration of just that. But I also think it's kind of important to think about, like, when we talk about school spending and we recognize that a third of urban schools across the country have more police officers per student than with no school nurses, with no guidance counselors. So we're like more interested in like having law enforcement referrals than we are mental health and guidance counselors for college and those kind of support systems. Those are things that aren't just the teacher quality, but it's like giving a culture to what we expect the support systems that we give our kids. And I think those are other things about money matters. How the money's spent communicates significantly what the value system and what the expectations for child achievement are. And so I'm thankful that you can kind of represent that for this community and many others. But thank you for those wonderful comments.
Folks, this is terrific. I'd like to open it up. I'm looking to that. I'd like to open it up to the floor for some questions. So I'm coming back. I'm going to get my step count in. First reached 12,000.
So I have a question. It's directed to Brother Dr. Johnson, if anyone can answer. Before I ask the question, though, I do want to say that I found the presentation intriguing. I do think this deserves a friendly debate on the topic.
Sure.
Because I think, and maybe the 21st century cities can host that. And there are things in the presentation that even though I believe the sociological evidence goes to the contrary, particularly the piece around the patterns of white secessionism from districts that pursue integration is something that perpetuates racial inequality. The increase, the pursuit of integration as a part of what increased the black middle class over the past 50 years, I think are all properly attributed in the presentation. So I don't know, maybe that's something that can be worked on. My question is a two-part question. The first is, in your research, have you looked at metricizing the harm that may have been done in black children being exposed to majority white spaces or racially integrated spaces, given the larger societal context of notions of black inferiority, black criminality? And if so, what are the kind of metrics that you were able to find to help look at that? And if not, why not? And then the second part of the question is, have you looked at what are some of the potential assets or benefits to the educational experience of children who are in majority black spaces? And were there ways to metricize that? And if those aren't things that you particularly looked at, just why not?
I think those are all great points. I'm going to begin, but certainly all of us should contribute. But I think the one thing I would just say is that I think there were a lot of resistance and a lot of biases that teachers have, that have continued to have, that have not embraced minority children's capacity and expectations for achievement, and have created school climates that are oppositional to success. I would not try to sugarcoat the integration process as some like simple or smooth effort. I think we really highlight these pioneers that I profile. like they had their homes firebombed for being on the school board to lead these efforts. I'm not suggesting that the path was easy, nor am I suggesting that the fact that black teachers were often the first fired when integration occurred, because white school boards sometimes implemented in ways that were discriminatory in those processes. So, and I also would not suggest that we could get the whole picture through a statistical analysis of test scores, that socio-emotional learning outcomes, that you believing in your capacity to be all that you can be. I'm a product of Morehouse College. I'm very proud of being a product of Morehouse College. I believe that the role model effects of having black economists teach black mathematicians before me, having a dad who was a high school history teacher, I certainly, they were formative. That's why I'm saying teacher diversity, but I'm not saying teacher diversity simply in the, do you have children or teachers in front of you that look like you? I'm talking about teacher diversity in a school system that gives that social capital to other peer teachers, that you don't have to look like the person next to you to build and teach effectively in a classroom. To have a multicultural curriculum, should that be only the black school that does it? Shouldn't we have a 1619 project about the history of contributions of minorities to our American history that's not, you gotta go to a black charter to get that? Is that not something that's a multicultural curriculum around the impacts of Hispanics to contribute toward, that would change perceptions about immigration reform? I'm just saying, not that that road has been easy, but I don't view it as like a reason to abort. And I think I went into these interviews with these pioneers expecting them to say, you know, we tried that. If I had to do it again, I wouldn't. That's what I thought they were in good standing to do after I heard some of the trauma that I was hearing. But man, they were some of the most committed and most believers, steadfast in the capacity of social change to be achieved. And so I think, in summary, I guess I would say, I believe that integration is like a surgery on a school system. It leaves scars, but it heals. That there's a restorative healing process that can accompany it, and that our consistent pursuit of white flight, middle class flight, it's like a painkiller for those trying to avoid diversity, but huge long-term side effects, not just on African American and Hispanic children, but on the country's economic success long-term. So I think this is an equity, excellence, and future that the diversity in our schools, well, I'll just say the diversity of our school children is here to stay. The question is whether we're going to harness that for the potential and value that it offers, or are we going to continue to kind of shun it and just create separate but unequal. So I think that's, the premise. But I appreciate all of what you shared, and the importance of culturally relevant pedagogy, the importance of teachers that really have a shared commitment to students of all shades, and ways of teaching a diverse set of students that maybe is not taught in our current teacher development programs and our teacher preparation programs. And I think that's just an omission that has to get significant attention. Thank you. But, you know, we have teachers right next to me, city council members, and professors who work on these issues, so you shouldn't only listen to me, but certainly the panelists with us.
Any of you want to?
So I know Davon very well, so I don't want to hog up the time. He and I can have a conversation later, but also with Professor, just so you know, this brother is a world-class debater, so you can pick the right one.
Right on.
The one thing I wanted to say on that is that as I was reading the book, I had done my research in Brazil years ago, and actually the guy I played basketball with there said to me, comparing the situation of Afro-Brazilians to African Americans, that the advantage that African Americans had was segregation, in that it was an opportunity to develop strong black institutions. And I'm not I have really mixed feelings about the whole idea, but and this gets at some of the questions that I raised about the political possibilities of doing this well. I would like to think we can do it, but it's a difficult question to think about how we get from here to there realistically.
I just wanted to echo what you said about integration is, we know that the kids who go into integrated schools choose to live in environments and choose to work in environments and have better economic outcomes for all the kids involved. And as a country, if we continue down that path, not only does it have economic consequences, but spiritual consequences for all of us.
Yes.
And our collective psyche.
Yes.
And then I just wanted to really echo your concerns about Comar 13A for 10506. I'm deeply concerned about the state board passing that, and I know it's in its 30-day comment period, and we're trying to work on it legislatively, but what are other ways to stop this from happening, and how do we have more communication with the state board to not, to educate and participate in a way to make this work happen? And I do agree politically this is hard. But are we public servants or are we working for re-election? And I think that's going to have to really play, when your average senator is worth $3.2 million and your school board pays nothing to work on, but requires 40 to 60 hours, who does that leave serving? And how do we change those policies to allow people of color and people from other socioeconomic means to serve and be in leadership positions to make those decisions?
I think we want to get, I see, yeah.
So one thing I would say about the state board is that your number one, I think, weapon needs to be patience, because bureaucracies have a way of, number one, not letting a win feel like a win. A bureaucracy will never let you walk away feeling good about the interaction. You talked about things on a spiritual level, and I do think bureaucracies have a way of really taking some spiritual energy out of us. And I think that Brandon's point about being willing to not be reelected is really important, because when I think about the context of the State Board of Education, it's largely an appointment-based system. So you've got this system of both bureaucracies and appointments that makes people have really different political, motivations and impulses than you would find in candidates who have to appear before the public and appeal to them in a general way. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not above being influenced and motivated, but I do think you need a different power analysis and a different understanding of how to do that. I'm about 4 months into this work as an elected representative of Baltimore teachers, and I think that understanding the state board has very clearly come into focus as something that we need to do a lot better, because the power that they wield to uphold all kinds of inequity in terms of teacher licensing, in terms of student demographic patterns, it really is like the hidden element that a lot of people don't really realize plays a major role in the day-to-day experiences of our kids.
Thank you for that.
So you have a state board member here, and I want to just take the case that you...
Also, just share your background so the others know.
I run the Institute for Education Policy at Johns Hopkins. I served as Commissioner of Education for the state of New York and Director of Education at the National Endowment for the Arts. I want to take your case because it reveals to me just how incredibly difficult these issues are, something that I think you rightly pointed to in your remarks. The reason for worrying about parental choice was based on multiple cases that come to us in executive session in which mostly minority parents were appealing against school boards, these district county school boards, because those parents' children could not take calculus, because those parents' children could not take AP courses, because those parents' children could not study something that the school just didn't offer. And so they desperately wanted the opportunity for their children to be in schools that offered them the kind of educational opportunity that you described. I am not naive. When I was commissioner, I saw some of the most racist behavior I've ever seen in my life, 20 miles out of New York City, in Long Island, where you couldn't actually move African-American children because the buses couldn't get under the bridges because Moses built them too low. So I'm not naive about the fact that parents may choose to abuse the better angels of their nature. What I'm suggesting is that these issues aren't just either or. They're difficult. If there were a way, and this is a point you made too, and then I'll be quiet, if there were a way to ensure that all the schools in these districts, which is my preference, would offer every child international baccalaureate, AP, right, dual enrollment. This is where we should be. We shouldn't have parents having to come to the school board and desperately appealing for the opportunity to get their child the education of their dreams. It's the wrong answer to a bad situation. But for them, for their child, it's the only answer, because we haven't built a better system. So one parent's choice is an appeal to the worst in us. The next parent's choice is an appeal to the best for their children.
I think we do this thing in education where we let good intentions wash away unintended consequences of poor policy. And I would challenge the writers of the regulation to be more specific with the language in that regulation, because I don't think that it is written to address the specific and legitimate concern that you raised.
That's good.
I'm going to take this in a little bit of a different direction. A colleague and I from University of Maryland have been looking at school rezoning decisions, how these decisions get made, and looking at the intersection.
Here in Maryland?
In Maryland, in Howard County and Baltimore County. And the intersection of housing, education, growth management, and development policies. And when we started this, we thought we would find that housing policy played a major role in how this all gets played out. But that wasn't the case. What really impacts these school rezoning decisions are the growth management. And in Maryland, that starts at the state level. They set the conditions of where, through their smart growth planning, those kind of tools that go with that, of where growth and development can take place. So you have areas that are designated for growth and there are other areas that are. So then you have the policies at the district level, which are very technical in a sense, that are responding to these essentially capacity issues. Okay, we have more capacity, what are we going to do? And in the end, the rezoning process resulted in very little movement or change in the composition of the schools. Now what's happening in Howard County this time, which wasn't part of our study, is that the county council initiated that by passing a resolution asking them to look at rezoning. So I mean that points also to the political aspect of these rezoning decisions. So I don't know if you looked at the growth and development policies in your research, but what we're finding, and this is preliminary, I mean, we have 2 case studies, but we wanted to get into the actual mechanisms of how these zoning decisions redistricting decisions get made.
Yeah, so I'm going to just speak on not Maryland specifically, but, or those two case studies, because you know that better, and certainly we have folks from Howard County too, but I'm just going to give you some study of results that was longitudinal from the whole state of North Carolina. And what they did was they looked at how the composition of the school board, when it changed and became more heavily Democratic versus more heavily Republican, and then they looked at when the majority shifted, how decisions around rezoning changed. And what found with Republican-controlled school boards, there was a significant movement toward rezoning that would be much more segregative, and that when Democratic school boards were able to win, this is across the whole state of North Carolina, systematic evidence over a 15 to 20 year period to document some of the sources of resegregation of the schools in North Carolina. But what they were able to show is that the politicization of the issue was a significant creator of segregation, independent of the housing segregation patterns. So I definitely lift up housing policy has to be implicated in this process, but I will also say that there's a lot of areas in which there's a lot more room for, and since we have Howard County, from what I can see, Howard County is actually one of the most integrated residential segregation relative to other places, let's just say. But the school segregation looks, at least on poverty dimensions, quite a bit higher. So those are things, I think that are relevant. But yeah, I think it's, yeah, so.
Folks, we're going to take one last question, and then it's time for the reception.
I have a question regarding housing. I'd like to know the impact on the schooling district, housing, and all of the abandoned homes in the city of Baltimore, how they close down the schools and combine the schools together, and the kids have to go all over the city just to get access to their education. I've experienced this firsthand. And it's like nobody seems to care what the kids go through. I mean, you shouldn't have to go to preschool to get out of high school. That's unheard of. And you're in the same community. They're closing down the schools. Homes all boarded up in the communities. You say housing is an issue. If the debate about the school bills and getting fair distribution of funds is an issue, why not work on another issue to build up the communities so that when people can move back into the communities and you have more of an argument for getting kids to go to school in their communities?
And so I guess I'll be the best to take that question. I think that you're right. These things are connected, right? But then we also have to add in the other historical context of Baltimore's housing stock is 4 million people, and we have 600,000 and decreasing each and every day. And actually, there was a second page article in the Sun this morning talking about the housing and the housing department's vacancy values program and how they're tearing down and renovating hundreds and thousands of vacant houses, but they can't keep up with the pace of how many more are being created. And when you connect all of these dots together, you go back to what I was saying earlier, that this situation was created by decisions and policies and things that were done decades ago, right? So we now have to deal with the listen, in 2012, my first full year on the city council, we were having this discussion around the 21st century schools thing, because we know that the state, they give out funding for capital improvements to school buildings based off the amount of children that are in the building. And one of the first things that the state said to the city, first they said, you guys have to participate and put up some money, but also they said to city schools is that you have more school buildings than you need because you have too much school buildings because of the population. So when you have schools that were slated to hold 800, 900 children in it that have 200, their best response was to combine those, right? And in order for them to get better schools. For example, Grove Park Elementary in Northwest Baltimore is closing at the end of this year, but Calvin Rodwell is being built bigger and brand new around the corner. And yes, it does create, in some instances, especially for those children who doing what they call the swing space years, what they call it, right? when you have to go be bused to another community to go to elementary school, which is unheard of here in Baltimore. Now, middle school and high school, that's just the culture of Baltimore. Typically, the high schools are not within the neighborhood. You always travel outside of the neighborhood. And what we have to do now is we have to integrate those things. And I think that they've done it better. Not a perfect job. They have to do much better job of thinking about all of those things in the connectivity. Also, the separation of city schools from the rest of city government plays a part of that too, and trying to have them be more cohesive and having a plan based on planning department, housing department, school system, thinking about everything that they're doing, warehousing. They did this to an extent, for example, in Pimlico, in Park Heights, where I live. When we were rebuilding the school, the housing department said, well, we can't rebuild the school and then have this whole row of vacant houses across the street. So the city's housing department took them over, renovated them. But even when you think about how long it takes to go through the process of receivership for one vacant house, right? 6 months to 2 years, basically, is what it takes. And again, the influx that you would need of dollars to just do what needs to be done. This is going to be a long-term commitment that we have to continuously make, and we have to invest more money in over time in order to deal with this issue, because we're not going to get rid of all the vacant homes in Baltimore in the next 2 years, let alone the next 4 or 5. This is going to be a long-term process, and what we have to do is cohesively work with schools and housing and all of the other agencies so that we can prevent as much as possible young people having to travel through swaths of vacant homes, and people having to travel miles and miles, especially for elementary and middle school, travel miles and miles to go to school, because you know what that does, right, in the morning. When I was in high school, I got up at 5:30. I was on the bus by 6 o'clock to make it by 8:15. And we didn't talk about transportation and how we, in Baltimore, we had $1 billion for a new subway line, and someone decided that we should give that $1 billion back. And now we have a bus system that was already broken that has now been rebroken, right? So all of these things play into play. And it's also very important about how these things connect at different levels of government, right? Because here in Baltimore, the local government doesn't really control schools, and they definitely don't control transportation. They do control housing, and we have to make sure as much as possible that people are cohesive in understanding. And that's why I always say, elections have consequences, because when people call my office and say, well, my bus doesn't come anymore, I almost always want to say, well, who did you vote for in the last election, right? But what, and also help them understand that, hey, okay, I'm going to help you navigate this issue, but really you should be in education. You should be holding your state officials accountable for how the public transportation system is, because that's where MTA gets their money. Everything has to be done in a cohesive way. And I'm sorry, you guys, but I'm going to have to step out because I'm 10 minutes late to be on my way to my next event.
Great. Thanks for being here. I think as he's closing down, I guess what I want to just lift up is the 21st Century Cities Initiative is really aimed to try to build a broader coalition about the research evidence about efficacy around what works, the issues around effectiveness, when does it work, and then trying to think about replicability so that we learn what other cities are doing. The National Coalition of School Diversity is a national organization trying to think about bridging communities across the country that are doing innovative work to try to build better traction on school diversity across the country. This panel is a representation of trying to then do and partner the research, practice, the policy community so that they're connected, so that the implementation of how do we make it work is connected to the evidence-based advocacy, and that set of things is not just dependent on good intentions, but that we're monitoring how well it's working. Because as we were talking about the charter school growth, charter schools, my only kind of major criticism, it's a lot of innovation without evaluation. And that's a recipe for inefficiency. When we kind of get these pieces connected, and notice how the arrows are in both directions, cross-fertilizing knowledge, that's really what we're trying to do. I know that the 21st Century Cities Initiative is aimed to be a place where those conversations are continued to be facilitated. So I want to thank Matt Kahn for his leadership in that, and I want to thank all of you for being a part of this conversation to stimulate further debate, but also further action. Thank you very much.